Good evening and welcome to the IOP's Speaker Series event, That's What She Said, Stories and Strategies from Political Speechwriters. My name is Ava Herrick and I'm a second year in the college from New York City, double majoring in public policy and sociology, and I'm particularly interested in political communications and journalism. At the IOP, I'm the Chicago section editor of The Gate. Last summer, I had the pleasure of working with the governor of New York's former speechwriter and hearing his fascinating stories about writing in the voice of public figures during some of the most defining moments of their careers. He introduced me to the captivating world of political speechwriting, which is why I'm excited to introduce the outstanding group of panelists we have here tonight. Sarah Hurwitz served as a White House speechwriter from 2009 to 2017, first for President Barack Obama and then First Lady Michelle Obama. Prior to her work at the White House, Sarah worked on several campaigns, including President Obama's presidential campaign in 2008, Hillary Clinton's primary campaign in 2008, and Senator John Kerry's presidential campaign in 2004. Mike Ricci has over 17 years' experience in communications at the federal and state levels. He served as Director of Communications for Speaker Paul Ryan and as Chief Speechwriter and Deputy Director of Communications for Speaker John Boehner. Mike also served as Director of Communications for Maryland Governor Larry Hogan, where he oversaw more than 120 public information offices across the state and led the state's public relations efforts in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Henry Connelly is the Senior Vice President of Communications at Precision Strategies. Henry is an expert policy communicator who designed innovative, nonpartisan engagement campaigns for clients like America 250 and Vote.org. He also served as communications director and chief speechwriter for Speaker Nancy Pelosi, working on some of her biggest political, legislative, and electoral fights and victories of the last decade. Moderating our discussion today is Jennifer Steinhauer, Senior Director at the Institute of Politics and former New York Times reporter who spent many years covering Washington. Together, they will discuss the ins and outs of political speechwriting, common mistakes, and moments they'll never forget. Some quick housekeeping before we begin. Please make sure to turn off or silence your cell phones. And second, when it's time for a Q&A, a microphone will be placed in the audience, and as usual, we'll give priority for first questions to students. Finally, please make sure to check out upcoming IOP events, including a pop-up of whether we are in the midst of a constitutional crisis tomorrow at 11 at the Institute of Politics, and David Hogg, American Activism in the Balance, on Monday, February 24th at noon here in Illinois. Make sure to check out the IOP's website for more. And now, please join me in welcoming to the stage Sarah Hurwitz, Mike Ricci, Henry Connelly, and Jennifer Steinhauer.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's event. It's really great to see everybody. Thank you for braving what I believe shocked all of our speakers today in terms of the temperature. And thank you, and hi to everybody on the live stream. Thanks for joining us again. So let's just dive into this topic. I think speechwriting is so fascinating to people because it's a skill that's like so elusive and you don't get credit for it, but it's also so laudatory. Everyone's excited by it. It's like you get to use your own skills with the pen, but you have to channel someone else who has a voice that's completely distinct from yours and has a very specific public image. And again, you don't get the credit for any of it. So I have a lot of individual questions for all of you about the folks that you did write speeches for, but I want to kind of start with one down the line, maybe starting with you, Mike. What is kind of, do you, in your view, both as a profession and specifically for the folks that you wrote for, do you think is the most important tool in your toolbox for being a speechwriter?
I think, well, good evening. Thanks all for coming tonight. I think, well, you gotta have a sense of humility. It's not an easy process. Everyone thinks they're a speechwriter or a writer. policy. I could never tell a policy expert how to do policy, but they could tell me how to write something or explain their policy. And so you have to accept that you're going to be at the center of a sometimes exhausting, sometimes very deliberative process. And so you have to become, I know we think of it as an art, as a craft, and it is, but you really have to become good at the process of it and managing. What I enjoyed about it was that you're at the center of everything in the office. You're writing for the principal, but you're involved in all the different things, the operations of an event and what the run of show is. But you're in the thick of the process itself. And so when I would talk to Hill staffers about speech writing, that's really what a lot of it focused on, was how to get better at understanding, their bosses or their chief of staffs, they would get back things with like red pen all over them, and how to deal with that, and how it makes you better as a writer. And so I think that you need to have humility, is how I describe it, but you really have to be in it for the long haul. It's not. You have to commit to it, is what I would say, and that's why I think it's so rewarding for those who are willing to stick with it and form that kind of relationship with their principal, get the trust of the people around you to be able to contribute, especially in such important historical moments. But you can't just airdrop into it, is my point. You have to commit to the process.
Yeah, I agree with everything you said. I think the humility is key, because you're not, people think this is like, oh, it's like being a poet or a novelist, and I'll sit in my cabin in the woods and opine. And it's like, no, you won't. Right? Speeches due Thursday, boss has ideas, so do 500 other people, and you are constantly getting fact-checked, you're constantly double-checking things. You don't know anything. Right? We are not experts. We are the people who are trying to tell a story from all of the experts' input. And most of all, we're trying to tell a story in our boss's words. I think something that really helps to be a speechwriter, especially today, is to just be able to talk like a human being, to have a real sense of what actual human beings talk like. I think so many speechwriters, sometimes so many politicians, frankly, live in the 90s, where they're like, I will yell a soundbite on the evening news, and then it will get in the morning newspapers. No, that media environment is utterly gone. Today, people see their politicians 24/7 on their phones. You're not just getting one soundbite from the evening news or the morning newspapers. And I think speechwriters who think that good speechwriting is about the one snazzy line, I think they've kind of missed the era, which is much more about you're seeing people in their full selves 24/7, for better or for worse. So, can you help your boss sound like a human being and sound like a decent, empathetic, caring human being who actually knows what's going on? So I think the art of speechwriting is much more human today than it was 20 years ago when I started out, where it was actually kind of the big soundbite. I think it's a different vibe today.
To echo both my colleagues, I think it's very important to be able to suppress your ego, even as you are sort of maintaining the stamina to drive a vision of a speech that holds together, that tells a story that is compelling, and that's not picked apart by all of the different policy teams or the different sort of interest groups that live within the ecosystem of an office, including sometimes the principal, and holding that all together and sort of preserving that core of emotion. And so, that's a balancing act, because I think particularly a lot of young speechwriters or speechwriters early in the process, early in their careers, have sort of this idealized version of what a great speech is. And it sort of flows from, at least if you're our age, probably, they want to sound like the West Wing or Aaron Sorkin. I don't know what the version of that is now. I mean, it's probably, it might be the Obamas, frankly. But that has a sameness to it. And so it's a pitfall for an inexperienced speechwriter to try to reach for this idealized but sort of same voice that doesn't convey personality, that doesn't convey the individualism of a member, that isn't relatable. It just sort of gets lost in, generic, lovely sounding words that don't connect, that don't drive, particularly for us, in the congressional speechwriting space. Your goals are to, win elections and win votes. And so everything really has to flow back to whether it moves the needle in some way there.
I will get back to some kind of like who the audience is for congressional speeches, but Sarah, it's unusual to go from the president to the first lady. The route, such that there is one, is usually the other way around. Right. Can you tell us a little bit about how that happened, and also, obviously, there's a very different jobs and very different people. That's self-evident. But what else was really striking about the difference in writing for those two individuals?
Yeah, so I was with Hillary Clinton in 07, 08, and when she lost, I was very lucky to get hired on the Obama campaign to write for him. And so I showed up there, and like maybe a week after I'd arrived, it was pretty late in the campaign, it was in July, I got pulled aside by my boss, John Favreau, and he said, you have to write Michelle's convention speech, her Democratic convention speech. And I got very offended. I was like, oh, because I'm the girl? Because I'm the only woman writer, I write for the wife? Like, oh, no, I'm not doing that. And then he said, no, you actually have to do that. And we were both, her chief of staff was Stephanie Cutter, this amazing, brilliant, just DC communications icon. And she was like, no, you will do this. So against my will, I got shoved into an office with Michelle Obama, and I kind of fell in love with her. I was just so struck by how smart she was, and thoughtful, and just totally honest. This like incredible honesty and authenticity. And I just, I really liked her. And we worked on the speech together, and it was an amazing experience. But I was like, no, I'm here to write for the candidate, not for the wife, not doing that. Wrote for him, we got to the White House, I wrote for him for about a year and a half. And the truth is, while I loved him and he was a wonderful person to work for, I just felt more at home in her voice. I was much more interested in what she was speaking about. It turns out I'm actually not a political junkie. And so the political news didn't really interest in me, writing a million speeches about the American Recovery Act because the economy was crashing. So that's all we were talking about. And she was out there talking about whatever she wanted to, because she's the first lady. And that is such a big difference, as you asked, between these two jobs. The president is the commander in chief. The president is the first responder. Whatever happens, and they are driven by the day's events and by news. So it is a very last minute job. It's a very hectic job. There's a certain voice of president that is not the kind of hey girlfriend colloquial voice. It's a commander-in-chief voice. There's a formality to it. And I think, when you are the first spouse, you have a lot more latitude. You talk about what you want to talk to about. You are a second or third responder, and you can kind of cultivate a much more informal voice, which is what she did. And I realized I liked it better, so I moved over to writing for her, and it was a different schedule. It was kind of moving more into talking about more personal issues. Like, she really spoke a lot to women. She spoke a lot to people who cared about children. She spoke a lot to military families. I just found that really moving. And it was kind of getting to see a part of the country that I didn't necessarily get to see when I worked for the president, which was much more official. When she does foreign travel, she's going to meet with a bunch of girls in a Peace Corps camp in Liberia who are learning about sex ed, or to talk to a bunch of mothers somewhere. And he is going to bilateral meetings with the prime minister of whatever. It's a very, very different experience, and I liked it better.
Did you have an internal struggle with that? Like, ooh, I'm sad that I like the girl job, or no, I accept that I like the girl job?
I did, because when I decided to make the move, a lot of people in the White House were like, what are you doing? Mm-hmm. Why are you, someone actually said to me, why are you demoting yourself?
Wow.
Which, now it seems absurd, because Michelle Obama is this global icon, but back in 2009, 2010, she was still finding her footing. Her number one priority was making sure that her girls were settled. So I think it looked like a strange move back then. And yeah, I did feel this sense of like, oh, is this a loss of prestige? And I look back on that now and just roll my eyes at myself, because I think if there's one piece of advice I can give to the students here, you can spend your entire life doing the thing that looks prestigious to others, doing the thing that looks great on the resume. But if it's not the thing that really lights the spark within you, you are going to feel like you're sleepwalking through your life. And the truth is, you're not going to be that successful. I was, to be totally honest, I was a mediocre writer for him, kind of middle of the pack writer for him, but I was a really good writer for her. And when I actually went to the place where I was best suited and where I really felt the spark and joy, then I became actually quite successful, right? It's like I got to write speeches that I'm really proud of and do things that I think were memorable, whereas I think with him I never would have, even if it was the more, quote, prestigious thing to do.
A very Washington story in both its beginning and its conclusion, and also very good advice. Yeah. Henry, let's talk about Nancy Pelosi. She is an amazing politician, incredibly skillful at everything that she does, number one badass. We can all accept that. Locution, public speaking, maybe not a 10. Maybe not quite on par with all the other things, right? That she's just awkward in front of a mic, it seems like. How did that factor into how you would write for her?
You know, she has very different priorities and needs. I think one of the things that is often, forgotten about the speaker is where that sort of badassness comes from, where her ability to lead her caucus, to organize, to whip votes, that all flows from the ways that she talks, the relationships that she builds. And so a lot of what she's doing that can sound, like an encumbrance on the page is she is holding a coalition together that she needs to allow her to do those things. And so, an example that comes to mind is we did a foreign trip to Dublin, and the whole ostensible purpose of the trip was she was going to go to the Irish Parliament. She was going to deliver a speech to protect the Good Friday Accord, which was then in some jeopardy because of Brexit. And she was going to go there and deliver the message that if the Good Friday Accord was harmed, the Democratic House would not approve the trade deal that the UK currently wanted. And in the middle of this speech, which seems like it should be, it's all sort of oriented around the anniversary of the Good Friday Accords and what this peace agreement means and the relationship between the US and Ireland, she takes 2, 3, 4 minutes of, a 20-minute speech to recognize the members of Congress who have come with her on the trip, because it is important that she build those relationships. And at the end of the day, she needs to make sure that her caucus knows that they are seen, knows that they are heard, that she recognizes their leadership, and that's what lets her show up and, in sort of miraculous ways, deliver the votes when folks don't think that's possible.
So you're looking at the speech as a political tool, almost more than a moment of flowery oratory or something like that. Yeah,
I mean, and I would also say the role of a congressional leader and a congressional leader delivering speeches is different. It is much more, it is blunter. It is less that a congressional leader is supposed to speak to the mood of a nation or to crystallize a sort of historic event as it's happening in the way that we often see from presidents. The speeches are political. They're focused on the fight of the day, the fight of the month, the sort of campaign message, and that means that they're often less memorable, but they serve a different sort of purpose.
Do you agree with that, Mike? And do you say there's a difference too? I'd be interested in hearing you reflect on if you agree with that. Is it different when you're in the minority and when you're in the majority in Congress for that type of political messaging via speeches?
Yeah, I think there's a gallows humor among leadership staff that the minority is more fun. You get to throw bombs. I think Henry's successors would disagree with that right now. It doesn't seem like a lot of fun, but ideally in the minority, you're
unencumbered.
Yeah, you're unencumbered, but you have to remember, putting in the context of when I was doing it, that's when the Tea Party was coming up, and so it really felt like we were trying to keep pace with the noise from the outside and keep pace with what was going on, as opposed to being able to sort of craft our own sort of proactive narrative. Whereas when we were in the majority, we at least controlled the calendar, and when you control the calendar to the extent that you can know, what's going to happen 1, 2, 3, 4 weeks ahead, you at least could have a sense, especially from a speechwriting perspective, of where things were going. So that's what, you had more ceremonial things and whatnot. But minority was, for me, it was a challenge, and I only did it for about a couple years or so under Boehner as minority leader. It was fun, but we were obviously the number one role was win the election, but that was when the Tea Party was kind of, so again, we were just trying to sort of fit ourselves into a mold that, I didn't know if at the time was really how Boehner actually felt, but again, it's where the votes were and it's where the energy was. And Henry and I were just talking about this, but it culminated in the spring of 2010 when Obamacare came to the floor for a vote, and all these protesters were outside with these signs, "Kill the bill," and it was bizarre, And so writing in that environment was, it was just, it was strange, and it was the beginning of sort of the arc that brings us to today. But Minority, again, you were trying to just, it just felt like a horse that you were trying to, stay on and just try to keep up with the activists, so to speak.
And I do want to talk about the interplay between the difference between Boehner and Ryan and Pelosi, but let me ask you something, Sarah. In terms of going back to President Obama, did you ever have a situation where you wrote a speech and he said, "I don't like it"? And what do you do in that situation?
Yeah, I did actually. When I was writing for him back in 2009, I wrote his first college commencement speech. It was at Arizona State University. And it was kind of a controversial speech because they, usually they give the commencement speaker an honorary degree, and they refused to give one to him, which was a little tacky and not great. But he, he's a very classy guy, and he was like, "Oh, we'll work into the speech. I'm going to say, yeah, I don't deserve an honorary degree. I don't deserve it. I haven't earned it. Like, here's, it was very classy." So I thought, oh, we got this. So, I met with him a few weeks in advance. He was distracted because the economy was crashing. You guys are probably a little too young to remember this, but literally the headlines were saying next Great Depression. The auto industry was crashing. The banks were crashing. It was a terrifying time to be in the White House. So guy had more important things to do than worry about some commencement speech. So he wasn't really paying attention, but I thought I got the feedback I needed. So I wrote him a speech, got it to him 9 days early, didn't hear anything, and thought I am good. He's no edits. The morning of the speech, I actually got woken up by a call from the Oval Office, and they said, "The president would like to see you and David Axelrod right away." Shout out to
That actually
Ax.
happens? You get a call
You
from the
do get a
Oval
call
Office?
from the Oval Office.
And is that a good feeling, or is that a feeling like, I don't like the feeling that I'm feeling?
He was. I knew he was not inviting me in to be like, "Nice job, champ. You did it, Tiger." That was not. It was very clear. And so, I throw clothes on. I run into the White House. And there's actually the White House photographer takes photos of every meeting the president has with staff. So there's actually a photo of me that day with my hair in this crazy messy bun, and I'm all disheveled. And the president is looking very crisp and commanding, and he's holding the speech like this. And what he's saying is, "I don't want to give this speech." He said it very nicely. He
Awesome.
said, yeah, it was great. He said, he said, "Well, look, I'm sorry. I didn't get to look at this till late last night, but this is not the speech I want to give." And I thought, well, that is unfortunate because this speech is today. But you can't, when you have to kind of be professional. So I said, "Oh, no problem, Mr. President. What would you like to say?" And he starts dictating an entirely different speech. And I'm thinking, wow, this is bad. So I'm typing away on my laptop, trying to get down what he's saying. And he's like, "You got this, you're fine, no worries." I was like, "No, it's fine." So I run back to my office and I'm frantically rewriting the speech. My colleagues are trying to help me. It's bedlam. A few hours later, I get him something. And he says, "Okay, good try. It's still too much of the old speech, though. We got to, get." And I'm thinking, oh, God. So I'm writing, and I'm about to miss the motorcade that takes staff to Andrews Air Force Base, where Air Force One is. It leaves about an hour early. So I call our schedulers. I was like, "I need more time." And they said, "No problem. We'll get you on the helicopter," which was cool. So I'm running out to the South Lawn an hour later with my laptop open, papers everywhere. I get into Marine One, which is tiny inside. It's a very small little helicopter. And so my knees are almost touching the president, but I'm hunched over, I'm editing. And as we're flying over the Washington Mall, he looks over, he goes, "Hey, what are you doing?" I was like, are you kidding me? He said, "Look out, enjoy the view. You don't get to do this every day." Which was very kind because he knew as a mid-level White House staffer, I was never getting in this helicopter again. So it was very, very nice. It was incredible. This is the economy's crashed and we have this speech in 4 hours and the man is like, "Oh, I want to do a kindness to my mid-level staffer." So it tells you a lot why so many of us stayed for all 8 years in that administration. But so finally we get on the plane, I'm still rewriting the speech. The computers on Air Force One in 2009 were very slow. So you would press a key and there'd be a delay, which was maddening. So I'm typing, it's delaying, I'm freaking out. And then, he's editing, I'm editing, it's bizarre. We land, and the printer, of course, is stuck and terrible. So I'm trying to print, and our trip director is like, get off the plane, motorcade's gonna leave. So I run to the cars. We are still editing the speech in the motorcade. I'm still getting emails on my phone. I was like, okay. So we get there, and I just think, I always tell junior speechwriters who I've worked with some speeches, it doesn't have to be good, it just has to be done. So I thought well, this is done, as is probably my career, but we're just gonna muscle through this. So I just remember thinking, this is probably gonna be a disaster. But Barack Obama just strides up to that podium and he just delivers that speech like he's been giving it every day of his life. Flawless, emotional, funny, people are laughing, they're crying, and I'm like, are you kidding me? We just wrote this in a car. I mean, it was wild. And then he finishes, thunderous applause, he strides off, we get back on the plane, he's striding down the aisle, and he's like, I think it went well, huh? Yeah, sir, that was great. Let's never do that again. So that was an adventure.
Mike, I would tell you to try to top that, but I think that's going to be a tough one. I wanted to ask you, I was looking back at, and I do want to talk at some point, and this may be a segue, and I don't know where it's going to go, but I'm just going to roll with it, about gun violence and how often that was a subject of speeches, whether they were short or lengthier speeches, in the time that all of us were in Washington. And I'm guessing that there are moments when, in fact, you were messaging on shootings in your own personal ways for the principals. And I would be interested in hearing your reflections on that. And I know, Mike, I was looking back at some things that Ryan said after the shooting at the congressional baseball game practice. There was a line, at times our emotions can get the best of us, this is in the chamber, to the House, the full House, I believe. We're all imperfect, but we do not shed our humanity when we enter this chamber. And there's another line after the shooting in Dallas, which I believe was after that, right?
The year before.
The year before. So the year before there was the shooting in Dallas, and gun bills were kind of somewhat a side subject of that. And he said, in having this debate, let's not lose sight of the values that unite us. Let's not lose sight of our common humanity. So why was that a theme that you or the speaker felt was important to bring to the House at those moments?
So Henry and I were talking about this last week. When these moments happen, we talked about this, so I read it again. I have no recollection of the actual writing of it. I remember that it happened on a Thursday night, this shooting in Dallas, and somebody woke me up the next morning. It's much less glamorous. You get a text from a scheduler that says, Paul wants to speak about this when the floor opens. Now, normally that's noon, 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock, but it was a Friday, meaning it was at 9 a.m. Oof. So I get in the car. I was probably talking to myself in the car, dictating it to myself or whatever. I get there at 7:30, whatever is on, I wrote it, and then we had an active shooter situation in the Capitol. So the speaker was getting an intelligence briefing down in the bowels of the Capitol. And so he was locked down there with an old printer, and I was at my desk. And so I never got to talk to him about it. He made a couple ad libs, and he did it. And he said it made him emotional as he was doing it. And you mentioned gun violence, and I think, that's what I remember the most, was just not the stress, but just so maybe that's why it was so sort of spare and just human, because it was just my raw thoughts as opposed to worrying about what this or that person in the chamber would think about it. But I think to draw a lesson as speechwriters, you can never really unplug, right? You always have to be thinking about what themes is your boss thinking about, what books have they been reading, who have they been meeting with, and so Paul was just doing a lot at the time on, he was just thinking a lot about, we've just been having conversations about it in passing, not like dramatic sort of me sitting there with a pad, taking his thoughts, just in passing, where I had become a father and he was giving me a lot of advice about it, and we were just having these conversations. And so I would just use little things and just infuse them here and there. Mm-hmm. I think that's a lesson. But for me, the first Saturday, when John Boehner became speaker, it was January of 2011, the first Saturday, there was a shooting in Tucson, Arizona. Congresswoman Gabrielle Giffords and members of her staff were shot and killed. We didn't know that yet, that some of the staffers, or one of the staffers, Gabe Zimmerman, had been killed. And that just had a profound impact on me because we've been speaker for, at that point, maybe 6 or 7 days. And so anytime a shooting would happen, including congressional baseball game practice, I really drew a straight line from that moment. And I think as speechwriters, when these traumas happen, we have to work, and we're human, we're parents, we're sons, we're daughters. And so a lot of times you don't process it, I think, until after you get through it. Because you have to, I remember there would be times, especially as we got into sort of the second half of the decade, the staff would be standing around looking at the TV and I'm just there, banging away on something, like wishing that I could just. So a lot of times that's why I think you can never, Nora Ephron, the late great Nora Ephron, who did a number of great, wonderful romantic comedies, When Harry Met Sally, You've Got Mail, she said everything is copy. That was her theory of writing. Everything around you is copy, and that's kind of for situations like you're talking about. You're just drawing on whatever's going on around you. You don't have time to sit there and structure it and think about the architecture of it. And to your point, in that case, you're just speaking to the chamber of members. Sometimes as the speaker, you get to speak to the country, but really you're speaking to this intimate chamber of members. And so it's better in that situation to think of it that way and give the speaker the ability to do that, to really feel like he or she is speaking to that audience right in front of you. And that's why it's kind of written in that sort of we, us kind of way.
It is interesting to sit with that one more beat, though, because if you think about the moment we're in the country, and as it's personified through what's going in Congress, both chambers, can you imagine the speaker, any speaker, the current speaker or the theoretical speaker now, trying to give a speech about common humanity and unifying in some form under that Capitol dome at this point?
No. Now, and this began to devolve, to be fair, it wasn't just recent. I would say the last 6, 7 years, there were protests in the House. There was a sit-in one night on the House floor, you may remember. I think it was over gun violence. So some of the speeches you're talking about, there definitely was a before and an after, I think. And it is, my short answer is no, I couldn't today.
Because it seems like he was leaning into that almost. Now those speeches to me read like warnings, where they were more like unity messages at that time. I wonder too, and I think about it with gun violence just because there were so many incidents and so many big, huge moments, and not just the incidents themselves, but the resulting debates over legislation, even votes over legislation at some point over that period of time that you were all in Washington at the same time. Do you feel like your principals were using the speeches through you to speak to each other or to address an issue to specifically counter each other, whether it was on guns or the economy? Do you remember listening to
I would say, there were often sort of extemporary, because the funny thing is about the House floor is that C-SPAN has sort of reduced the need for members to sit in the floor and listen to debate, but often as you're waiting for, the rack of members ahead of the speaker or the minority leader to go, they'll hear something that inflames, Pelosi would often hear something that sort of inflamed her, that was like, something egregious or wrong, and she would sort of break from her prepared remarks to call out something that the other side had said. But on something like, on something like the gun violence, it was increasingly, I think, for us, there was more and more feeling that that the pro forma thing to do is say, we give thoughts and prayers to the victims and nothing else. And that became more and more first it was an undercurrent, and then it was a more and more explicit part of what we said around these events. And the awful bit about gun violence in the context of this sort of conversation is that we came to expect it. And so it's not like we had it's not like you keep a boilerplate, terrible thing happens, say this X, Y, or Z, but it was it was a muscle that we exercised so frequently that there was a little bit less of, with the exception of, for instance, like the shooting at the congressional baseball practice, that was different in a way because it tipped into political violence, and that was a sort of more, that was a new a horrible and threatening thing of a different nature than what we saw increasingly as part of this policy debate, in which, because it happened so often, we knew more and more about what we needed to say the moment that it happened.
I wanted to go back to Michelle Obama. I was reading her remarks in support of her husband in 2008, later in support of Hillary Clinton, and later in support of Kamala Harris. And what are your observations and your reflections in, obviously she's supporting three different principles in those moments, but in terms of her message, her tone, her goals, in all those cases, she just seems to increasingly connect with people. Specifically, it seems like women. But what are your observations about how she evolved, and therefore the role of writing for her evolved?
I mean, I think she really kind of, something I love about her is this like relentless authenticity. So I think, in the early years of the White House, I would often see people tell her, well, this is how first ladies do this. And she was like, well, thanks for sharing. Here's how I'm going to do it. And so, it was like first ladies host very fancy concerts at night in the White House, and fancy people come and they're rich and they sit around being fancy. And she's like, okay, and I'm going to have the performers come 8 hours earlier and spend time with kids from the inner city who would never normally go to the White House, so that they understand that this is their home as much as anyone else. And I think she really did that with her speeches too. She was always telling a story. Like, I realized she was kind of telling an 8-year story. So if you look at her Democratic convention speeches, her speech in 2012, she's like, the last time we came together, it's like she's almost continuing a conversation. She's like, when I came here last, blah, 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 and here's what's happened since then, and here's what we've learned. And then again in 2016, like, she was kind of continually telling an ongoing story, which I think was really interesting. And I think it made people feel like they were part of something, that she was just very honest with them. And I think you especially saw it this year in the convention speech that she gave at the Democratic convention, where she got up and she said, like, my mother has just died and I wasn't sure I'd be steady enough to come here tonight. It's like, this is what I love about her. Like, she's just so incredibly honest, and she can't be fake. She's not going to give you a like, good morning, the middle class are the middle of my priorities. Get it? It's a soundbite, middle. Like, she's never going to do that, right? She's going to come to you and say, here's who I am. Here's what we're talking about. Here's what's real. And I saw her just becoming, she was always that way, but I just saw her becoming more and more that way. And I think her convention speech in 2024, I found it just thrilling. Like, there was a real sense of she wasn't in the role of first lady. She didn't have this official job. She was a citizen, and she just gave a speech that was really, I loved it. I thought it was electrifying and very, very hot. And I did not think she went low, by the way. I think she kept it high, but it was tough.
I wanted to ask you about one line in support of Hillary Clinton, but first I want to fact check you. Fact check true. My daughter came home from high school one day during the Obama administration, said, have you ever heard of this guy, Jack White? I said, yeah. And she said, yeah, he was playing in my high school atrium this morning, playing guitar. It was like, that one, it was because he was going to the White House and they were doing a concert, I think, and he did send them to high school. So that is absolutely true that those performers would show up bizarrely at people's high school, and beyond. But there was one line in support of, during the Hillary Clinton campaign, where she was talking, it was kind of in the middle of the Me Too movement.
Yes.
And she was talking about, well, actually it was in response to...
it was actually before the Me Too movement.
Yes, it was in response, I believe, to Trump's tape, comments on the tape. And she said, it has shaken me to my core in a way that I couldn't have predicted. Do you remember the exchange about that line and what
Yeah,
where that came
this
from?
was October of 2016, which is, that's like a time in a presidential campaign that you just don't want to screw anything up. You just don't know unforced errors. And this was after Trump had declared how much he loves assaulting women. There was this Access Hollywood tape. He was bragging about sexually assaulting women. And Mrs. Obama was, like basically any human being with a soul, really deeply horrified by that, and just really, it was very personal to her. that comment, and she felt strongly that she needed to say something about it, which is like not really ideal weeks before a campaign. You don't really want to give this kind of speech, but she was pretty clear she was going to give this speech. And, you know, it was a speech on behalf of Hillary, but for her to just go out and give us that speech as if nothing had happened would have been a lie. And she's just so relentlessly honest. She said, no, we're going to talk about what's just happened. And so she gave what I really think is like one of the earliest Me Too speeches. It's a very raw and vulnerable and really tough speech about sexual assault and about misogyny and about how much it hurts not just women, but men, people of all genders. She was pretty blunt about that. And I will tell you, the response we got to that was unbelievable. The number of emails, letters, people saying, yes, thank you, I don't want my son talking like this either. I don't talk like this. My father doesn't talk like this. This is actually not just boys being boys. Or people writing in and saying, you know, I was assaulted and I'm not going to be ashamed anymore because of the way you talked about it. So it was really pretty, it's worth reading or watching if you haven't. It was given in Manchester, New Hampshire in October of 2016.
And can you talk a little about the process of that? I mean, how does, and I'd be curious too to hear analogous stories from both of you guys about process on the more memorable speeches. How does that work? Does she just talk in that kind of very personal tone? Yeah. Does she talk and you kind of write, or do you write and she responds? How does that work?
Yeah, I mean, you can have all kinds of processes. You can have processes where the person's like, I don't know what I want. Give me something to react to. I hate it. Now I'm going to blow it up the night before the speech. I've been there, never going to do that again. But with the Obamas, the great thing is they know who they are and they know what they want to say. Michelle Obama did not. No one scripts Michelle Obama. So I would sit down with her and she'd say, here's what I'm thinking. Here's where my head is. And she would just speak like paragraphs and paragraphs of ideas, themes, stories, you know, just everything she wanted to say, and I would type it verbatim in my laptop, and that was really the beating heart of a draft. So I would go and work that into a draft. I'd then email it around to 70 people in the White House who would give comments and edits, a lot of which I ignored because they were bad, and I could do that because I was protecting her voice. As you know, Henry mentioned that, like, you're really protecting the person's voice. And then I would give it to her, and she would edit, I would edit, she would read it out loud, just to see how it sounded, and we would edit as she read out loud, and it's like, this line doesn't work, this is clumsy, and then she would give it. So that was the best process I've ever had with someone.
Do you have similar, were your principles different in terms of that process, or how would you compare and contrast?
You know, again, I think like with any speechwriter has the gamut of process between you have, well, I'll say, like, for instance, a no process speech was Pelosi was going to announce whether she was going to vote for or against the Trans-Pacific Trade Partnership. And because she was going to vote against the president, it was an incredibly closely held secret of just which way she was going to go on this huge vote until she told the president in her office, like, an hour and 15 minutes before she walked onto the floor. And so we had, you know, like, I had no idea of where to, you know, what the sort of rationale for her decision was, and it was very much sort of a Hail Mary sort of, you know, put something on a page and she'd, you know, go out and say what it would be. Other times it really flowed from, you know, I found that I was able to have a lot of access with the speaker, and you would see, because, you know, we would have these meetings 2-3 times a week with the whole Democratic caucus, you would see her behind closed doors giving just extemporaneous speeches to her members. And flowing from that would be the themes and the turns of phrases that she wanted to highlight, the arguments that she felt like were compelling and connecting. And so you would draw from what you heard in those closed door, behind the scenes moments, and then you would sort of distill that and work in the, you know, talking points and proof points that you've been working all along to sort of, you know, get to a more succinct message on something like ACA or, you know, this or that. So sometimes there was a lot of confidence in what you were going to say with her, and other times it was just like, hope it works. I don't know.
So among a few facts about John Boehner that most people know, is that he's an emotional man. There are things that make him tear up. Anything involving schools or kids, troops, like lots of different kinds of foreign policy. So basically, the sphere of things you could write about for him was kind of small. And so what I would do is I would go up to his office and I'd say, hey, we're going to do a speech about X. Do you have any stories about X? And he was a great storyteller. He is a great storyteller. And I would watch his face to see, if he was cracking up a little bit. Because when you go in front of a camera or a podium, it's much more magnified. And so I would have to either, okay, I'm not going to do this. And it was unfortunate because he would have great stuff. He would have great stuff that I would have to discard this or do like a very sawed down version of this. Once in a while, I would still try to put something in, and I would get a call to come up to his office, never a good thing. And he'd be like, I can't do that. And he would just point to the paper and he said, I can't do that. I followed this rule all but one time. It was a commencement speech at Catholic University. And he had a football coach. He went to a Catholic high school in Cincinnati, Moeller High School. He was a man of Moeller. And a football coach named Jerry Faust. And everything with Jerry Faust was about the Virgin Mary. And Speaker Boehner is very devout, prayed every morning, does the rosary. And the morning that he ran for leader of House Republicans in 2006, he went to church, St. Peter's on Capitol Hill. He prayed as always. And as he walked out of Mass, he got a call from Coach Faust. And in smaller rooms and circles, he would say, I've never gotten a call from the Virgin Mary, but that was about as close as it comes. And he got emotional and he said, I can't do that. The morning of the speech, it was a Saturday, went to the Capitol. I put it in. I just put it right in there. I wasn't a prompter, so I just put it in. And we were driving there, and I see him open the folder, and I'm waiting, and I'm waiting. And I'm not going to say what he said in mixed company, and he's like, you, whatever. I said, sir, and I was only been with him for about a year or two at this point. I said, sir, I need you to trust me. It's a Catholic, university. And he did it, and obviously, this is not a story about me, it's just a story that, I had to be discerning, and I always followed, but once in a while, and I'm sure each of us has a story like this, you just got to push your principle. It's not, why keep that from people? Share it for people. And to this day, he uses it as an applause line, and I'm glad. And again, it's not about me, it's about, following the process, but once in a while, you got to color outside the lines a bit and try to lead them, where they should go.
Be brave. That sounds like the message there. There's a microphone here, I believe, and people can start lining up with your questions. I'm going to ask you guys one last quick round for the group while folks line up. And that is, did you ever have to write a speech that made you uncomfortable, that you disagreed with in terms of the tone or message that you were being asked to navigate?
Honestly, I consider myself pretty fortunate that I was never in that position with Speaker Pelosi. I've been in that position in other times in my career, earlier in my career, and it was definitely, it was harder than it should have been. But I truly count myself very fortunate that was not something that I had to deal with.
Yeah, people often say, like, what happens when you disagree with the person you write for? I'm like, I don't. Mm-hmm. I'm not writing for people with whom I disagree. Did I sometimes disagree with how they wanted to say something? Sometimes, but I will tell you, with the Obamas, like, they were always right. They'd get up to the podium and do it their way, and I was like, yep, that was better. So, yeah, it was. I also consider myself very lucky.
Yeah, I couldn't point you to any. There were times that people, there's a, show the fight, like we had to, and Speaker Boehner is not a big partisan warrior. Neither Speaker Ryan, and the advice was like, and so we did it. My regret was just that there were times it just felt like kind of was not relentlessly authentic. I will say that, and it showed. And maybe I was the only person who knew that it wasn't relentlessly authentic. But there were just times I felt like and this happens. You got to show your members you're fighting, and you got to pound the podium literally. And So maybe there were times I just didn't agree with the tone that folks, senior staff wanted to take. I mean, we did it, but so those are the kinds of things that I remember. But never did I disagree or was I ever uncomfortable. No.
Okay, awesome. I think we have folks at the microphone. So if you could introduce yourself, students first, please, and say your name and your year and your major, and remember, as usual, to have your questions and the question mark.
Hi, my name is Jen. First of all, I'd like to thank you all for taking the time to speak with us. This was a very valuable and very insightful conversation. Thank you so much. My question is for you, Ms. Sarah. When writing for Michelle Obama, how did you ensure your speeches stayed true to her values while also sort of addressing a broader audience with diverse perspectives?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think, it's like easy for me to be like, she was always relentlessly authentic, and she was, but she also has to be heard, right? So like there were, I think about her convention speech in 2008, which came at a really fraught time for her. I feel like you guys are also young. You were probably either not born or very young, but there were all these currents of racism and sexism flowing together, leading to this just incredibly offensive and absurd message that she was an angry black woman. I'm like, really? You can't even come up with a new, ugly slur stereotype? Really? You guys not only are racist and sexist, but you're dumb? But whatever. Very frustrating. So we knew that was true, right? And so I think, but in a way, I often think the relentless authenticity was how she kind of responded to that message, because she could have gotten up and tried to give some dumb sound bites that kind of addressed that, but instead she was like, that's the story about me, fine. I'm gonna be me, relentlessly, authentically me. And I really think when you do that, whether people like you or not, there's a real respect for you. I remember one of my first speech writing jobs was from a senator from Iowa named Tom Harkin, very, very liberal guy. And I remember traveling with him to Iowa and being at some event, and a guy was saying, he was like, you work for Harkin? He's like, I disagree with that guy on abortion and immigration and healthcare. He's wrong on this, he's wrong on that. He goes, but I vote for him. I was like, why? And he says, because I know what he believes. I know where he stands. He's honest with me. And I thought okay, that's an extreme example, but for better or for worse, the politicians there's nothing hidden about Donald Trump, right? There's no behind the scenes thing. This is him. And I think when compared to the kind of poll tested, scripted, insulting, I am yelling sound bites in your face, it can be pretty appealing. But it's a challenge.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Hi, my name is Yang. I'm a graduate student in sociology. We know that Trump often rejects the teleprompter for instinctual, unscripted, and long-form engagement. And the role of White House speechwriter is no longer merely to compose, but to navigate and amplify a president's authentic voice. So could you help us imagine how might the profession adapt to maintain rhetorical and historical significance in Trump era, where performative immediacy often overshadows literary weight?
Wow.
Who wants that one?
So it's obvious, it's a great question. I would say two things. First, we've seen, just in the last week or so, J.D. Vance make news for a couple of speeches, and somewhat encouraging to me in the sense that anytime a speech makes news, it's encouraging that speech making is still relevant and vital. But also that I think if you want to understand, where the future of our party is going, you probably want to be more focused on his speeches than President Trump's speeches. JD, whether you agree with him or not, is a broad thinker, and I think a lot of he himself is in these speeches. Maybe not all of it, but so that's my first sort of practical point. There's no question, though, Republicans, we have a cabinet that's essentially out of central casting, and I don't just mean because so many of them are on Fox News, but because a lot of the way they're communicating right now is they just put these videos up on social media where they're talking to the camera. They're all sitting in their office, they're all talking to the camera. They're about 3 to 4 minutes, and I would say they're very effective. They go directly to people, they're unfiltered. They obviously repeat their talking points, so to speak. But I think that's some of the future is there, going direct to people, unfiltered. Podcast is obviously one form of that. But I think, we saw this early on with some of the early crises of this administration. There's the Secretary of Transportation just on social media just giving you an update about what's going on with a plane crash. So those are a couple things that I've been thinking about, is how this sort of go direct, we sort of probably remember the beginning of that trend, whereas now you're seeing it in a much more polished and focused way, and I think you're going to continue to see, at least from the Republican perspective, the White House continue to do that, while Democrats are still sort of standing there waiting 20 minutes to go for their 4-minute cable hit that somebody then has to try to put on social media. You can see the difference. So those are a couple of thoughts I had.
Yeah. I'm sorry, I didn't realize there was a mic over here, so let me go over here.
Hi, my name is Autumn Rivera, and I'm a second year in the college studying public policy and history. And you guys talked a little bit about your different processes and how a lot of your speech writing is kind of copying their tone and they're trying to portray this authentic vision of them. How have you guys noticed your own writing styles being integrated into the speeches? And also when you're switching who you're speaking or who you're writing for, do you notice a struggle in trying to switch over to getting this new voice to come through?
I would say I think the best speech writing relationships, the most productive ones, I think, do become intimate relationships where your own sort of internal voice and the principal's voice become increasingly indistinguishable from each other. And so the practice is you channeling the way that they think, the way that they express themselves, and that does get into the way that you sort of natively write or natively process things. And so it can be quite a shift when you sort of pull out of that voice and try to parachute into another voice. From time to time in the speaker's office, from time to time in the minority leader's office, we would draft a rank and file member's speech for a weekly address, the bane of Mike's and I's existence for our time in the minority. And so you would just sort of go from this very intimate connection to the speaker's, the principal's voice into a member who you didn't really know how they spoke about, and it was the given issue. And so that was tricky. And there are ways, there's the way in which speech writing and professional speech writing, on the outside of that sort of deep relationship can become a little bit more of craft. It can become a little bit more of making sure that there's a little piece of gold, a little piece of research, a quote in everybody's speech that sort of makes it sound specific and interesting and boilerplate. And that can be seen as a good speech, but I think often you'll sort of lose the fidelity to voice, particularly in the political side, that you really need the relationship to strengthen.
So interesting. Over here.
Hello, I'm Robbie. I'm a second year at the college. I was curious, another question on the future of speech writing. What do you think the impact of artificial intelligence will look like, especially we've only had it in full form for maybe a few years, but how do you see that impacting speech writing, especially maybe on those short-term, chaotic examples that you were discussing? Do you think it will ever be good enough to substitute what the art of speech writing is?
I mean, I really wish we could go back to the 90s. I think that was the right level of technology. I think we've gone downhill since then, but we're here, and I think you're right. I think I will say, when ChatGPT first came out, one of my Obama colleagues, he actually fed it a speech writing prompt. He said, and I think it was actually, we were talking about school shootings, he said, there's been a school shooting at this school in this city. President Obama needs to give a speech to that community. Please write a speech. And what ChatGPT generated, my colleague sent to us, and he said, this is better than what 90% of American speechwriters would write. It was surprisingly good. And that was, a little bit shocking and a little disheartening. So will it really be doing final drafts? I'm not sure. Will it be doing drafts? Maybe. Is that plagiarism that's going to corrode our brains and destroy our souls? I think so, but again, I want to live 30 years ago, so I'm probably the wrong person to ask, but maybe these guys have more insights and less technophobia.
I think the challenge is that it contributes to the same problem that we've been talking about, which is it contributes to sort of the sameness
Yes.
of political rhetoric. I don't need AI to tell me that small businesses are the backbone of America.
Oh my God, or that healthcare is a right, not a privilege.
I don't need it to tell me that we need to keep the farm in the Farm Bill. So mostly I teach a class at Georgetown, so I use it just to understand, as an advisory tool for certain things, and that's my issue with it. It doesn't give me anything that obviously, yes, it obviously would cut down on the time, but I can't say it's ever like, oh, I wouldn't have thought of that, And so that's my concern, is that it will just contribute. Like if you go on LinkedIn now, you can just kind of have AI write your posts, and so now we have all posts that sound the same, and a bunch of posts with people saying that all the posts sound the same, and so that's my concern, that to Sarah's point about corrosion, that it will just, it's just creating this vicious cycle.
And I think speechwriting is, at the end of the day, a person has to say the speech and a person has to hear it. And so, somewhere along the line, maybe it can do a first draft, or it can do better than the green speechwriter, but at some point, it has to make that leap into what comes out of a person's mouth, and is it heard? And as Mike's saying, the sameness is a huge problem across all political communications.
Yeah.
So many so many professionals are trying to sort of match imagined version of what a great political speech should sound like, or what a great ad should look like, or what a great message should seem like, and they sort of hold themselves to, is a speech better or worse, or an ad better or worse because it looks like the thing that they're already thinking of, and that just has less and less effectiveness. And I think in part that's why we see some of the dynamic of how President Trump is really disrupting what we think of the sort of value of prepared text, because there is, we can't minimize that behind the words there's something deeper that is being conveyed. There's something more fundamental, something more elemental and raw that a politician or a political party needs to demonstrate to its voters, to demonstrate to the public. And you are just never going to get that if you keep pretending, if AI or bad expectations management keeps pushing you towards, well, it's great, you sounded like a politician, you sounded like a good politician. Like, does that help? Does that get you elected these days? Like, less and less.
Yeah.
Hello, I'm Jacob. I'm a fourth year in the college, and you kind of touched on this already, but I was curious to hear about, what do you think are the biggest mistakes that either you or others in your field have made, and how have you bounced back? Or since speechwriting is part of communications more generally, what do you think are the biggest mistakes that your respective parties are making right now in terms of delivering a message?
Oh, God.
Two-parter there. We could really spend some time.
That's it. I know. You're catching us at a low moment here. I have to say, I think a lot of the really uniquely bad speeches out there, they are telling you and not showing you. So Michelle Obama could have started her 2016 convention speech by being like, okay, everyone, when my girls started, when we got to the White House and my daughters went to their first day of school in the White House, I was anxious and scared and uneasy and worried and afraid and nervous. It's like, who cares? Or she could have said, which she did say, on my daughter's first day of school, I watched them climb into those big black cars with those large men with guns, and I saw their little faces pressed up against the window, and I asked myself, what have we done? Okay, if I call you tomorrow morning, are you gonna remember the list of adjectives, or will you remember the image? So often there's just this blah, 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 Teflon writing, it slips off you, it just doesn't say anything, it's dumb sound bites, it's a bunch of adjectives, but creating painting an actual picture, when you show people that, they don't forget it, right? They take it away. It says all those adjectives are encoded in the picture, so I think that's critical. I'm just, not to be a broken record, but I look at so many Democrats speaking. I traveled the country with Mrs. Obama, and every 2 years, she would speak for these Democratic candidates for Senate, governor, Congress, and we'd meet them backstage, and they were amazing. Funny, sassy, quirky, tough. I really liked them. I was like, oh, this person, I can't wait to hear them speak. And they would get up and they'd be like, hardworking American middle-class families, the American dream. It's like, that's not even, like you would never turn to your roommate and be like, hey bro, I just think hardworking American middle class families are the heart of the American dream. Like, if you wouldn't say something to one person, don't say it to many people. And I think that we are just, I watch these Democratic politicians yell talking points and sound bites in my face, and I can't, I think this is just, it is the bane of my existence as a speechwriter, watching speeches. It's insulting, it's offensive, it hasn't worked for 30 years, and yet they just keep doing it. I don't, like, why are we so bad? I mean, I feel like Republicans are better at this than we are. Am I wrong? Is this just my own self-criticism from my own side? I don't know.
No, I think that Trump. Well, no, I think that what Trump did. I remember. It sounds silly now, but I remember when Build the Wall became a thing, and every Republican was like, "Man, that's really smart." And every Republican on Capitol Hill wanted their own Build the Wall, like their sort of 3-word solution to every problem. And I swear, I sat in meetings where people tried to write on a whiteboard, like, "What's our version for healthcare of Build the Wall?" And they're like,
This makes me feel better. Okay, maybe we're not the worst.
Maybe
All right.
yeah.
Oh, yeah.
So I think that Trump definitely took a lot of the sort of country club, small businesses backbone thing, got away from that. But now it's just a lot, it's obviously so online. And I think what concerns me, and as somebody who worked in state government, I feel this too, is, we're putting a lot of ideology out to people, but sometimes people just, like, growth is great, great, sounds great, but people just want to call back when they call a government agency. They just want, like, their email returned. Like, a lot of times you can get pretty far if your speech is just about solving a problem and being useful to people. And that's what concerns me about both parties, frankly.
I will also say something, there's just power to saying something true. Just saying something awkwardly, uncomfortably, bracingly true, which Barack Obama did in his 2004 convention speech. When the guy got up and he said, let's face it, my presence on this stage is pretty unlikely. It's a weird start to a convention speech. He then went on to tell people about how his father was a Kenyan goat herder. Again, not a great idea if you have political ambitions to be like, I have foreign roots. But he basically said, I know what y'all are thinking. You want to know why a guy named Barack Hussein Obama is on this stage, and I'm going to call you on it. I know you're thinking it. I'm going to just point the elephant in the room, and I'm going to just run right into the elephant. And it was like, wow, he did that. That was bracing, and I think Trump actually does some of that. And I think it's sort of, in a way, it shows some respect for people because it's not talking around or talking over. It's talking to what is right there.
I think in a way, and I'll play devil's advocate here for the sake of diversity of what we're telling you. I think one of the, to spell out the reason that you wind up getting that sort of yelling of talking points is, the parties, particularly the Democratic Party and these members are desperately trying to get attention and to develop a consistency of message. And the rationale, which I think as we've sort of talked about here, is deteriorating somewhat based off of how folks consume media, is that for the most part, folks are not going to listen to the whole speech. For the most part, people are going to see one sentence pulled out of, this 5-minute lovely, well-crafted thing that you put together in, a quick little thing that they're just like skimming through on social media or appears in a news story. And so there's so much pressure on trying to make sure that that one single sentence distills a complex policy issue. And if you're a Democrat in particular, you love a laundry list. You love to get stuck explaining. Like, I can't tell you, I've been part of, 3 or 4 different agenda rollouts that's it's supposed to be like the campaign agenda that really sells a message, and they're this this
29
long.
points.
They're like, here's my truly, we had a 30-point plan for, this was middle class jumpstart.
Stop.
We didn't win the majority of that year, if you're wondering.
I want to try to get to one more question if I could over here.
On the flip side of the past question, is there a speech from the past few years that each of you wishes you had written? Or is there a speech from maybe earlier in your career that really impacted you or your process?
Ooh, that's a good one.
That's a good question.
I feel like, Mike, you're probably not going to say J.D. Vance's speech in Europe.
No.
It's nice to make news.
No, I follow a lot of British politics. I just find their politics more interesting than ours, to be honest. And so, but I think if you look at, I've been thinking about when Tony Blair became leader of the Labour Party in the 90s, he had to give a lot of speeches challenging the Labour Party's socialist orthodoxy. And it was just so brave. He just goes up there in front of these hundreds of people. Like, you would never see this. It was just so, 2004 is a good analogy too. It's like, you just don't see that anymore. Like, going up in front of a group of people and being like, you're wrong, you've been wrong for 50 years. And like, he changes the party within 3 to 4 years, and it was all started with one speech. And so sometimes I think about, especially, when you write speeches in congressional context, you're not always sort of speaking to the country, but there are moments where speeches can be very consequential and sort of like 2004, where you're launching something and you can look back. So, in moments like this historically, I try to look at like analogies and, and what people should be doing.
Unless you have instant jealousy, I think we're going to have to end here because the time is up. Thank you, everybody, for coming out on such a freezing cold night, and especially to our wonderful guests coming from Washington for this. Thank you. Thank you. Take everybody at home.